Lost Cities of the Bible, Unearthing History's Hidden Truths. In 1952, a British archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon stood at the edge of an ancient trench in the West Bank, staring at something that would spark a controversy lasting 70 years. The walls before her had collapsed violently, catastrophically, but when? The Bible says one thing. Her radiocarbon dates said another. And buried in that gap between faith and science lies one of archaeology's most explosive mysteries. Here's what keeps me up at night. Scattered across the Middle East are cities mentioned in some of history's most influential texts, places where prophets walked, where armies clashed, where entire civilizations rose and fell. Some archaeologists have spent their entire careers searching for proof these places existed at all. Others have found them, but what they discovered challenges everything we thought we knew. Today, we're going beneath the surface of two of the most controversial archaeological sites on Earth. What's hiding in the dirt might surprise you. Jericho section. Let's start with a story you probably know or think you do. Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. 7 priests, 7 trumpets, 7 days of marching. On the 7th day, the Israelites circle the city 7 times. The trumpets sound, the people shout, and the walls come tumbling down. It's one of the Bible's most cinematic moments, right up there with Noah's Ark and the parting of the Red Sea. But here's where it gets interesting. There really is a city called Jericho. In fact, it's one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on the planet, dating back nearly 11,000 years. The archaeological site, called es-Sultan, sits about a mile from modern Jericho in the West Bank. And yes, archaeologists have found walls there. Multiple sets of them actually built and rebuilt over millennia. Some of these walls did collapse, violently, so case closed, right? The Bible was accurate? Not so fast. When Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho in the 1950s, she found something that didn't fit the narrative. The city's destruction layers the archaeological evidence of violent collapse, dated to around 1550 BCE. The problem? Most biblical scholars place the Israelite conquest around 1400 BCE or even later, around 1200 BCE. That's a gap of anywhere from 150 to 350 years. In archaeological terms, that's not a rounding error. That's the difference between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. But wait, there's more to this puzzle. In the 1930s, before Kenyon's work, archaeologist John Garstang had excavated the same site and concluded the walls fell around 1400 BCE, perfectly matching the biblical timeline. He found pottery, scarab beetles, and other artifacts that seemed to support a late Bronze-aged destruction. So who was right? Garstang or Kenyon? Enter Bryant Wood, an American archaeologist who re-examined Kenyon's findings in the 1990s. Wood argued that Kenyon had misidentified certain pottery styles and that the destruction actually occurred closer to 1400 BCE after all. He pointed to evidence of Egyptian scarabs from the 18th dynasty, burnt grain storage suggesting a quick conquest rather than a prolonged siege, and collapsed walls that fell outward, not inward, which would have allowed attackers to climb over the rubble into the city. Here's what makes this so fascinating. We're not debating whether Jericho existed or whether it was destroyed. Those facts are settled. What we're debating is when it happened and why. The evidence is real. The walls are real. The burn marks are real. But the interpretation? That's where science meets story, where hard data collides with ancient texts. and where things get genuinely complicated. And there's something else worth considering. Jericho wasn't destroyed once. It was destroyed multiple times across its long history. Different conquerors, different eras, different reasons. What if the biblical account conflates multiple destructions into a single narrative? What if the story preserves a cultural memory of repeated violence at this strategic oasis city, compressed and mythologized over centuries of oral tradition before being written down? The truth is, we don't know for certain. And that uncertainty? That's not a weakness of archaeology. It's actually its greatest strength. Megiddo section. Now, let's travel about 60 miles north to another site that makes Jericho look simple by comparison. Megiddo, or as you might know it from the book of Revelation, Armageddon. The name itself comes from Har Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo, and according to biblical prophecy, it's where the final battle between good and evil will take place. Dramatic stuff. But strip away the apocalyptic imagery, and you find something even more remarkable. A city that witnessed more violence, more warfare, and more strategic importance than perhaps any other place in the ancient world. Tel Megiddo sits in northern Israel, overlooking the Jezreel Valley. And here's why it mattered. It controlled the most important trade route in the ancient Near East, the Via Maris, or Way of the Sea. This road connected Egypt to Mesopotamia, Africa to Asia, the Mediterranean to the East. Every empire that wanted to control regional trade had to control Megiddo. The Egyptians knew it. The Canaanites knew it. The Israelites knew it. The Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans all knew it. Archaeologists have identified 26 distinct layers of civilization at Megiddo. 26. Each layer represents a different city, built on the ruins of the one before. Some were destroyed by war, others by earthquake. Some simply declined and were abandoned. But again and again, people returned to this hill, rebuilt, and started over. Why? Because geography is destiny, and Megiddo's location made it too valuable to abandon. Now here's where it gets fascinating from a biblical perspective. The Bible mentions Megiddo multiple times, and archaeology confirms many of these references. In the book of Joshua, Megiddo is listed as a Canaanite city that wasn't fully conquered by the Israelites. Archaeological evidence from the late Bronze Age shows a thriving Canaanite city at exactly this period. In the book of Kings, King Solomon fortifies Megiddo as one of his royal chariot cities. Excavations in the 1920s revealed massive stable complexes that were initially attributed to Solomon's era, though later dating pushed them to the reign of King Ahab about a century later. But here's the twist that keeps archaeologists arguing: those stables. For decades they were held up as proof of Solomon's grandeur, evidence that the biblical account of a wealthy, powerful, united monarchy under Solomon was historically accurate. Then radiocarbon dating and ceramic analysis suggested they weren't Solomonic at all. They were built roughly 100 years too late. Does that disprove the Bible? Not necessarily. It suggests the biblical timeline might be compressed, or that later scribes attributed earlier achievements to more famous kings. Or maybe Solomon did build structures that were later rebuilt by Ahab. The layers at Megiddo are so complex, with so much rebuilding and reuse, that untangling what belongs to which era requires detective work that would make Sherlock Holmes jealous. What's undeniable is the violence. Destruction layers show the city burned multiple times. Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III besieged Megiddo in 1457 BCE, and his victory inscriptions at Karnak match archaeological evidence of destruction. The Assyrians conquered it in 732 BCE again, confirmed by both Assyrian records and burn layers at the site. This wasn't just a place mentioned in ancient texts. It was a place where empires clashed, where blood soaked into the earth so many times that Armageddon became synonymous with ultimate conflict. Daily life section. But here's what most documentaries miss, and it's my favorite part. These weren't just battlefields. They were homes. Between the wars, during the peace, people lived in these cities. They baked bread. They told jokes. They fell in love and raised children and argued with neighbors and worried about harvests. And archaeology reveals this too. At Jericho, excavators found storage jars still full of grain that was carbonized, preserved by the fire that destroyed the city. That grain tells us about Bronze Age agriculture, about what people ate, about harvest times and food security. At Megiddo, archaeologists uncovered a sophisticated water system, a massive shaft cutting down through bedrock to an underground spring, allowing the city to withstand sieges. The engineering is breathtaking. Think about the labor, the planning, the mathematical precision required to tunnel through solid rock with Bronze Age tools. We found pottery painted with everyday scenes, toys for children, jewelry that wasn't valuable enough for looters to take, but precious enough that someone wore it daily, weights and measures that tell us about trade practices and economic systems, temple complexes that reveal religious practices beyond what texts describe. At Megiddo alone, archaeologists discovered an altar with remains of animal sacrifices, offering physical evidence of worship practices mentioned throughout the Hebrew Bible. This is where archaeology transcends the debate about proving or disproving religious texts. It humanizes them. The Bible isn't wrong when it describes cities and people and conflicts. These things happened. But archaeology adds texture, context, the messy reality of actual human experience. It reminds us that these stories weren't just theology or literature. They emerged from real places where real people lived complex, textured lives. So where does this leave us? Here's the honest answer. With more questions than we started with, but better questions. The archaeological record at Jericho and Megiddo and dozens of other biblical sites confirms that these places existed, that they were important, that they witnessed violence and habitation and cultural exchange. It confirms that the ancient world described in biblical texts was real, but it also complicates the timeline, challenges specific claims, and forces us to think more carefully about how ancient texts relate to historical events. And that's not a failure. That's exactly how knowledge progresses. Right now, new technologies are revolutionizing biblical archaeology. Ground-penetrating radar can map entire buried cities without disturbing the soil. Environmental DNA analysis can tell us what animals lived in an area, what crops grew, even what diseases afflicted populations. Isotope analysis of human remains reveals where people were born, what they ate, how they migrated. We're reading ancient texts in new ways too, using AI to reconstruct damaged scrolls and computational linguistics to trace how stories evolved. There are sites mentioned in the Bible that haven't been excavated yet. Some haven't even been located. Every year brings new discoveries, a seal with a biblical name, a building that matches a description, a destruction layer that aligns with a historical account. And every discovery refines our understanding, adding pieces to a puzzle that will never be completely finished, because the past is vast and most of it remains buried. The forensic investigation continues, not to prove or disprove faith. That's not what archaeology can do, but to understand history more fully, to connect ancient texts with ancient realities, to bridge the gap between story and stone. The lost cities of the Bible aren't lost anymore. We've found them. But in some ways they're more mysterious now than when they were just names in ancient books. Because now we can walk where people walked, touch what they touched, and ask new questions about old truths. And that's more exciting than any simple answer could ever be.